History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 5, The Making of the European Age. Chapter 4, Europe's Assault on the World. In India, the main rivals of the English were not the Dutch or the Portuguese, but the French. What was at stake did not emerge for a long time. The rise of British power in India was very gradual. After the establishment of the Fort St. George at Madras and the acquisition of Bombay from the Portuguese as part of the dowry of Charles II's queen, there was no further English penetration of India until the end of the century. From their early footholds, Bombay was the only territory they held in full sovereignty. Englishmen conducted a trade in coffee and textiles, less glamorous than the Dutch spice trade, but one which grew in value and importance. It also changed their national habits and therefore society, as the establishment of coffee houses in London showed. Soon, ships began to be sent from India to China for tea. By 1700, Englishmen had acquired a new national beverage, and a poet would soon commemorate what he termed cups that cheer but not inebriate. As a defeat of the East India Company's forces in 1689 showed, military domination in India was unlikely to prove easy. Moreover, it was not necessary to prosperity. The company therefore did not wish to fight if it could avoid it. Though at the end of the century, a momentous acquisition was made when the company was allowed to occupy Fort William, which it had built at Calcutta. The directors in 1700 rejected the idea of acquiring fresh territory or planting colonies in India as quite unrealistic. Yet all preoccupations were to be changed by the collapse of the Mughal Empire after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707. The consequences emerged slowly, but their total effect was that India dissolved into a collection of autonomous states with no paramount power. The Mughal Empire had already before 1707 been troubled by the Marathas. The centrifugal tendencies of the empire had always favored the Nawabs or provincial governors too, and power was divided between them and the Marathas with increasing obviousness. The Sikhs provided a third focus of power, originally appearing as a Hindu sect in the 16th century. They had turned against the Mughals but had also drawn away from Orthodox Hinduism to become virtually a third religion with it and Islam. The Sikh formed a military brotherhood, had no castes, and were able to look after their own interests in a period of disunion. Eventually, a Sikh empire appeared in the northwest India, which was to endure until 1849. Meanwhile, there were signs in the 18th century of an increasing polarity between Hindu and Muslim. The Hindus withdrew more into their own communities, hardening the ritual practices which publicly distinguished them. The Muslims reciprocated. On this growing dislocation, presided over by a Mughal military and civil administration which was conservative and unprogressive. There fell also a Persian invasion in the 1730s and consequent losses of territory. There were great temptations to foreign intervention in this situation. In retrospect, it seems remarkable that both British and French took so long to take advantage, even in the 1740s. The British East India Company was less wealthy and powerful than the Dutch. This delay is a testimony to the importance still attached to trade as their main purpose. When they did begin to intervene, largely moved by hostility to the French and fear of what they might do, the British had several important advantages. The possession of a station at Calcutta placed them at the door to that part of India which was potentially the richest prize, Bengal, and the lower Ganges Valley. They had assured sea communications with Europe thanks to British naval power, and ministers listened to East India merchants in London as they did not listen to French merchants at Versailles. The French were the most dangerous potential competitors, but their government was always likely to be distracted by its European continental commitments. Finally, the British lacked missionary zeal. This was true in the narrow sense that Protestant interest in missions in Asia quickened later than Catholic, and also more generally in that they had no wish to interfere with native custom or institution, but only, somewhat like the Mughals, to provide a neutral structure of power within which Indians could carry on their lives as they wished, while the commerce from which the company profited prospered in peace. The way into an imperial future led through Indian politics. Support for rival Indian princes was the first indirect form of conflict between French and British. In 1744, this led for the first time to armed struggle between British and French forces in the Carnatic, the southeastern coastal region. India had been irresistibly sucked into the worldwide conflict between British and French power. India had been irresistibly sucked into the worldwide conflict between British and French power. The Seven Years' War, 1756 to 1763, was decisive. Before its outbreak, there had in fact been no remission of fighting in India. Even while France and Great Britain were officially at peace after 1748, the French cause had prospered under a brilliant French governor in the Carnatic, Dupleix, who caused great alarm to the British by his extension of French power among native princes by force and diplomacy. But he was recalled to France, and the French Indian Company was not to enjoy the wholehearted support of the metropolitan government, which it needed to emerge as the new paramount power. When war broke out again in 1756, the Nawab of Bengal attacked and captured Calcutta. His treatment of his English prisoners, many of whom were suffocated in the soon legendary Black Hole, gave additional offense. The East India Company's army, commanded by its employees, Robert Clive, retook the city from him, seized the French station at Chandernagore, and then, on 22nd June 1757, won a battle over the Nawab's much larger armies at Plassey, about 100 miles up the Hooghly from Calcutta. It was not very bloody. The Nawab's army was suborned, but it was one of the decisive battles of world history. It opened to the British the road to the control of Bengal and its revenues. On these was based the destruction of French power in the Carnatic that opened the way to further acquisitions which led inexorably to a future British monopoly of India. Nobody planned this. The British government, it is true, had begun to grasp what was immediately at stake in terms of a threat to trade and sent out a battalion of regular troops to help the company. The gesture is doubly revealing, both because it recognized that a national interest was involved, but also because of the tiny scale of this military effort. A very small number of European troops with European field artillery could be decisive. The fate of India turned on the company's handful of European and European trained soldiers and on the diplomatic skills and acumen of its agents on the spot. Upon this narrow base and the need for government in a disintegrating India was to be built the British Raj. In 1764, the East India Company became the formal ruler of Bengal. This had by no means been the intention of the company's directors, who sought not to govern but to trade. However, If Bengal could pay for its own government, then the burden could be undertaken. There were now only a few scattered French bases. The peace of 1763 left 5 trading posts on condition that they were not fortified. In 1769, the French Compagnie des Indes was dissolved. Soon after, the British took Ceylon from the Dutch and the stage was cleared for a unique example of imperialism. The road would be a long one and was for a long time followed reluctantly, but the East India Company was gradually drawn on by its revenue problems and by the disorder of native administrations in contiguous territories to extend its own governmental aegis. The obscuring of the company's primary commercial role was not good for business. It also gave its employees even greater opportunities to feather their own nests. This drew the interest of British politicians who first cut into the powers of the directors of the company and then brought it firmly under the control of the crown, setting up in 1784 a system of dual control in India, which was to last until 1858. In the same act were provisions against further interference in native affairs. The British government hoped as fervently as the company to avoid being dragged any further into the role of imperial power in India. But this was what happened in the next half century, as many more acquisitions followed. The road was open, which was to lead eventually to the enlightened despotism of the 19th century Raj. India was quite unlike any other dependency so far acquired by a European state, in that hundreds of millions of subjects were to be added to the empire without any conversion or assimilation of them being envisaged except by a few visionaries and at a very late date. The character of the British imperial structure would be profoundly transformed by this, and so, eventually, would be British strategy, diplomacy, external trade patterns, and even outlook. Except in India and Dutch Indonesia, no territorial acquisitions in the East in these centuries could be compared to the vast seizures of lands by Europeans in the Americas. Columbus's land had been followed by a fairly rapid and complete exploration of the major West Indian islands. It was soon clear that the conquest of American lands was attractively easy by comparison with the struggles to win North Africa from the Moors, which had immediately followed the fall of Grenada and the completion of reconquest on the Spanish mainland. Settlement rapidly made headway, particularly in Hispaniola and Cuba. The cornerstone of the first cathedral in the Americas was laid in 1523. The Spaniards, as their city building was intended to show, had come to stay. Their first university was founded in 1538 and the first printing press was set up in Mexico in the following year. The Spanish settlers looked for land as agriculturalists and gold as speculators. They had no competitors, and indeed, with the exception of Brazil, the story of the opening up of Central and South America remains Spanish until the end of the 16th century. The first Spaniards in the islands were often Castilian gentry, poor, tough, and ambitious. When they went to the mainland, they were out for booty, though they spoke as well of the message of the cross and the greater glory of the crown of Castile. The first penetration of the mainland had come in Venezuela in 1499. Then, in 1513, Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama, and Europeans for the first time saw the Pacific. His expedition built houses and sowed crops. The age of the conquistadors had begun. One among them, whose adventures captured and held the imagination of posterity, was Hernan Cortes. Late in 1518, he left Cuba with a few hundred followers. He was deliberately flouting the authority of its governor and subsequently justified his acts by the spoils he brought to the crown. After landing on the coast of Veracruz in February 1519, he burnt his ships to ensure that his men could not go back, and then began the march to the high central plateau of Mexico, which was to provide one of the most dramatic stories of the whole history of imperialism. When they reached the city of Mexico itself, they were astounded by the civilization they found there. Besides its wealth of gold and precious stones, it was situated in a land suitable for the kind of estate cultivation familiar to Castilians at home. Though Cortez's followers were few, and their conquest of Aztec Empire, which dominated the central plateau, heroic, they had great advantages and a lot of luck. The people upon whom they advanced were technologically primitive, easily impressed by the gunpowder, steel, and horses the conquistadors brought with them. Aztec resistance was hampered by an uneasy feeling that Cortes might be an incarnation of their god, whose return to them they one day expected. The Aztecs were very susceptible to imported diseases too. Furthermore, they were themselves an exploiting race and a cruel one. Their Indian subjects were happy to welcome the new conquerors as liberators, or at least as a change of masters. Circumstances thus favored the Spaniards. Nevertheless, in the end, their own toughness, courage, and ruthlessness were the decisive factors. In 1531, Pizarro set out upon a similar conquest of Peru. This was an even more remarkable achievement than the conquest of Mexico, and if possible, displayed even more dreadfully the rapacity and ruthlessness of the conquistadors. Settlement of the new empire began in the 1540s, and almost at once there was made one of the most important mineral discoveries of the historical times, that of a mountain of silver at Potosi, which was to be Europe's main source of bullion for the next 3 centuries. By 1700, the Spanish Empire in the Americas nominally covered a huge area from the modern New Mexico to the River Plate by way of Panama and Acapulco. It was linked by sea to the Spanish in the Philippines. Yet this huge extent on the map was misleading. The Californian, Texan, and New Mexican lands north of the Rio Grande were very thinly inhabited. For the most part, occupancy meant a few forts and trading posts and a larger number of missions. North to the south was what is now Chile, well settled. The most important and most densely populated regions were three: New Spain, as Mexico was called, which quickly became the most developed part of the Spanish America; Peru, which was important for its mines and intensively occupied; and some of the larger and long settled Caribbean islands. Areas unsuitable for settlement by Spaniards were long neglected by the administration. The Indies were governed by viceroys at Mexico and Lima as sister kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, dependent upon the crown of Castile. They had a royal council of their own, through which the king exercised direct authority. This imposed a high degree of centralization in theory. In practice, geography and topography made nonsense of such a pretense. It was impossible to control New Spain or Peru closely from Spain with the communications available. The viceroys and captains general under them enjoyed effective independence in their day to day business. But the colonies could be run by Madrid for fiscal advantage, and indeed, the Spaniards and Portuguese were the only powers colonizing in the Western Hemisphere. for over a century who managed to make their American possessions not only pay for themselves but return a net profit for the metropolis. This was largely because of the flow of precious metals. After 1540, silver flooded across the Atlantic to be dissipated, unfortunately for Spain, in the wars of Charles V and Philip II. By 1650, 16,000 tons of silver had come to Europe, to say nothing of the 180 tons of gold objects. Whether Spain got other economic benefits is harder to say. She shared with other colonizing powers of the age the belief that there was only a limited amount of trade to go around. It followed that trade with her colonies should be reserved to her by regulation and force of arms. Furthermore, she endorsed another commonplace of early colonial economic theory, the view that the colonies should not be allowed to develop industries which might reduce opportunities available to the home country in their markets. Unfortunately, Spain was less successful than other countries in drawing advantage from this. Though they prevented the development of industry, apart from the processing of agricultural crops, mining, and handicrafts in America, the Spanish authorities were increasingly unable to keep out foreign traders from their territories. Spanish planters soon wanted what metropolitan Spain could not supply slaves, especially. Apart from mining, the economy of the islands and New Spain rested on agriculture. The islands soon came to depend on slavery. In the mainland colonies, a Spanish government unwilling to counterance the enslavement of the conquered populations evolved other devices to assure the supply of labor. The first, started in the islands and extended to Mexico, was kind of a feudal lordship. A Spaniard would be given an encomienda, a group of villages over which he extended protection in return for a share of their labor. The great fact was not easily distinguishable from serfdom or even from slavery, which soon came to mean black African slavery. The presence from the start of large pre colonial native populations to provide labor did as much as the nature of the occupying power to differentiate the colonialism of Central and South America from that of the North. Centuries of Moorish occupation had accustomed the Spanish and Portuguese to the idea of living in a multiracial society. There soon emerged in Latin America a population of mixed blood. In Brazil, which the Portuguese finally secured from the Dutch after 30 years fighting, there was much interbreeding both with the indigenous peoples and with the growing black population of slaves who had first been imported to work on the sugar plantations in the 16th century. In Africa, too, the Portuguese showed no concern at racial interbreeding, and its lack of a color bar has been alleged to have been a palliative feature of Portuguese imperialism. Nonetheless, though the establishment of racially mixed societies over huge areas was one of the enduring legacies of the Spanish and Portuguese empires, these societies were stratified along racial lines. The dominant classes were always the Iberian born and the Creoles, persons of European blood born in the colonies. As time passed, the latter came to feel that the former, called Peninsulares, excluded them from key posts and were antagonistic towards them. From the Creoles, there led downwards a blurred incline of increasing gradations of blood to the poorest and most oppressed, the pure Indians and black slaves. Though Indian languages survived, often thanks to the efforts of the Spanish missionaries, the dominant languages of the continent became, of course, those of the conquerors. This was the greatest single formative influence making for the culture unification of the continent. Though another of comparable importance was Roman Catholicism. The church played an enormous part in the opening of Spanish and Portuguese America. The lead was taken from the earliest years by the missionaries of the regular orders. Franciscans in particular, but for 3 centuries their successors worked away at the civilization of Native Americans. They took Indians from their tribes and villages, taught them Christianity and Latin. The early friars often kept them from learning Spanish to protect them from corruption by the settlers, put them in trousers, and sent them back to spread the light among their compatriots. The mission stations of the frontier determined the shapes of countries which would only come into existence centuries later. They met little resistance. Mexicans, for example, enthusiastically adopted the cult of the Blessed Virgin, assimilating her with the native goddess Tunantzin. For good and ill, the church saw itself from the start as the protector of the Indian subjects of the crown of Castile. The eventual effect of this would only be felt after centuries had brought important changes in the demographic center of gravity within the Roman communion, but it had many implications visible much earlier than this. It was in 1511 that the first sermon against the way the Spanish treated their new subjects was preached by a Dominican at Santo Domingo. From the start, the monarchy proclaimed its moral and Christian mission in the New World. Laws were passed to protect the Indians, and the advice of churchmen was sought about their rights and what could be done to secure them. In 1550, an extraordinary event took place when the royal government held a theological and philosophical inquiry by debate into the principles on which the New World peoples were to be governed. But America was far away and enforcement of laws difficult. It was all the harder to protect the native population when a catastrophic drop in its numbers created a labor shortage. The early settlers had brought smallpox to the Caribbean. Its original source seems to have been Africa, and one of the Creoles' men took it to the mainland. This was probably the main cause of the demographic disaster of the first century of Spanish Empire in America. The church, meanwhile, was almost continuously at work to convert the natives and then to throw around them the protection of the mission and the parish. Others did not cease to make representations to the crown. The name of one, Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican, cannot be ignored. He came out as a settler only to become the first priest ordained in the Americas and thereafter as theologian and bishop. He spent his life trying to influence Charles V's government and not without success. He brought to bear the discipline of refusing absolution even in the last rites to those whose confessions left him unsatisfied over their treatment of Indians and argued against opponents on a thoroughly medieval basis. He assumed with Aristotle that some men indeed were by nature slaves, but denied that the Indians were among them. He was to pass into historical memory anachronistically as one of the first critics of colonialism, largely because of the use made of his writings 200 years later by a publicist of the Enlightenment. For centuries, the preaching and rituals of the church were virtually the only access to European culture for the American peasant, who found some of Catholicism's features sympathetic and comprehensible. To European education, only a few had access. Mexico had no native bishop until the 17th century, and education, except for the priesthood, did not take a peasant much further than catechism. The church tended, in fact, for all the devoted work of many of its clergy, to remain an imported colonial church. Ironically, even the attempts of churchmen to protect the native Christians had the effect of isolating them from the routes to integration with the possessors of power in their societies.